Imagine dying and having no idea what comes next. No light, no tunnel, no voice telling you where to go. Just darkness, silence, and the crushing weight of not knowing if you're moving in the right direction, or if there even is a right direction. Now imagine that somewhere, thousands of years ago, a civilization decided that was completely unacceptable. So they wrote you a manual, not a prayer, not a poem, not a collection of comforting words, designed to make the living feel better about losing someone. A manual, step by step, turn by turn, gate by gate. A literal, structured, ruthless, specific guide for navigating exactly what happens to your soul the moment your body stops breathing. They didn't guess, they didn't hope, they engineered it, refining it over centuries, testing it against their deepest beliefs, and then burying it with their dead for over 1,000 years because they were absolutely certain that without it, your soul was not just lost, it was gone forever. And the detail that will keep you up tonight, we almost never found it. If one man hadn't walked into the right tomb at the right moment in 1888, this entire story, this entire system, this entire map of the afterlife that a civilization spent 3,000 years building would still be buried in the dark where the dead left it. So before we go any further, if you've never heard this story before, you are in exactly the right place. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and do not look away. Because what this book contains is something no history class, no documentary, and no mainstream retelling has ever fully unpacked. This is the unfiltered version, and it starts with a discovery that should have been impossible. The year is 1888. A man named E.A. Wallace Budge, a curator for the British Museum, is standing in Egypt staring at something that should not exist. A papyrus scroll, nearly 80 feet long, covered in hieroglyphics so detailed, so deliberate, so structured that it couldn't be religious decoration. It couldn't be mythology. It was organized like something written for actual use, because it was. What he was holding was one of the oldest surviving copies of what we now call the Egyptian Book of the Dead, though that name doesn't even come close to capturing what it actually is. The Egyptians didn't call it that. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because the entire point of this text wasn't about death at all. It was about survival. It was about beating death, outmaneuvering it, walking through the underworld the same way. You'd walk through a dangerous city if someone handed you a map and said, follow this exactly, or you don't come back. This book was not written for priests. It was not written for scholars. It was written for you, the dead person, to read, recite, and use as a weapon against everything waiting for you on the other side. Spells to protect your heart, passwords to get past guardians, exact phrases to speak in front of a divine court that would decide, on the spot, whether your soul deserved to live on, or get destroyed completely and permanently. No second chances, no mercy rounds, one shot. And for over 1,500 years, the ancient Egyptians made absolutely sure that anyone who could afford it went into that moment, prepared. This is the story of the most important book ever written for the dead, what it said, why it existed, and what it reveals about a civilization that understood death in a way we still haven't fully processed. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. For thousands of years, it was buried, not hidden in a vault, not locked behind palace walls, buried, literally pressed against the bodies of the dead, tucked inside coffins, sealed inside tombs that were constructed with one explicit intention, that no living person would ever open them again. The ancient Egyptians weren't hiding it from the living. They were sending it with the dead, because in their understanding of the universe, the dead needed it infinitely more than the living ever could. What makes this book so deeply unsettling isn't just its age. Though at over 3,500 years old, it predates most of what the modern world considers ancient. What makes it unsettling is its tone, its absolute, unwavering, almost aggressive confidence. There is no uncertainty in its pages, no perhaps, no we believe, no language designed to comfort the grieving or soften the reality of what death actually involves. It reads like a document written by people who had already been to the other side and came back specifically to leave instructions. Most ancient texts are deliberately vague about the afterlife. They speak in metaphors, symbols, poetry, language engineered to inspire awe rather than provide directions. They tell you death leads somewhere meaningful without ever committing to the specific coordinates. The Egyptian Book of the Dead does none of that. It gives you names, locations, dialogues. It tells you exactly what you will encounter, word for word, what will be demanded of you, and precisely what you must say in return. in the correct order, with the correct intonation, at the correct gate. Get one detail wrong and the book doesn't offer a retry. For over 1,000 years, this document was the most important object a person could own, not in life, but in death. Families saved for it, scribes spent careers perfecting it, and yet the modern world had absolutely no idea it existed until a tomb was cracked open that was never, ever supposed to be found. And what they pulled from inside, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about how ancient people understood death. Here is the detail that every mainstream retelling conveniently leaves out. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not written by one person. It was not delivered in a single divine revelation. It was not the product of one extraordinary mind sitting down and mapping the afterlife in a moment of inspired genius. It was constructed deliberately, methodically, over the course of several centuries by a rotating cast of priests, royal scribes, and theological scholars who approached the afterlife the way a modern engineer approaches a structural problem. Identify the variables, anticipate the failure points, build in redundancies, test, revise, repeat. The earliest foundations trace back to what Egyptologists call the pyramid texts, spells, and protective verses carved directly into the interior walls of royal tombs around 2400 BCE. These weren't decorative, they were functional, operational instructions for a soul navigating unfamiliar terrain. And at this point in Egyptian history, they were exclusively reserved for one category of person, the pharaoh, because only the pharaoh's soul was considered significant enough to require guided passage. Everyone else, merchants, soldiers, mothers, craftsmen, died and entered the unknown completely unassisted. The map existed, but access to it was the most exclusive privilege in the ancient world. Then something shifted, and nobody fully agrees on why. By around 2000 BCE, the protective spells began migrating from tomb walls onto coffins. The wealthy class, merchants, generals, high-ranking officials, had begun demanding the same afterlife protection the royal family had been quietly hoarding for 400 years. The texts evolved, expanded, and became what scholars now call the coffin texts. But even that wasn't the most significant development. Around 1550 BCE, everything changed permanently. Scribes began assembling the complete system, every spell, every warning, every gate and guardian and declaration, into a single portable papyrus document, purchasable, personalizable. Your name, written directly into the text by a trained scribe, inserted into spells and divine declarations as though the entire book had been written specifically for you from the beginning, which, in every way that mattered to the Egyptians, it had been. This was not passive religion. This was not Sunday worship and hopeful waiting. This was a civilization that looked at death as the most complex, most dangerous, most consequential journey a soul would ever undertake, and decided, with characteristic Egyptian pragmatism, that preparation was not optional. But what exactly they were preparing you for was something far darker, far stranger, and far more specific than anyone looking at this from the outside would ever expect. The Egyptians called it Duat. And before you file that away as another ancient mythology term, stop. Because the Duat was not mythology to the people who believed in it. It was not symbolic. It was not metaphorical. It was not a spiritual concept designed to give death a comforting narrative framework. To every Egyptian who ever lived, the Duat was a real location, a specific, mappable, navigable realm that existed in a dimension running parallel to the living world. Beneath it, through it, and extending far beyond it in directions the human mind could barely process. It had geography. It had residents. It had rules, politics, a functioning hierarchy of beings who had existed long before the first human being drew its first breath. And the moment your soul left your body, you were inside it. According to the Book of the Dead, the entry point was a corridor, long, lightless, and immediately hostile, lined with gates that appeared at intervals with no warning and no mercy. Each gate was different. Each one was guarded by a being that existed for one singular purpose, to stop unauthorized souls from advancing further. And here is what separates this from every other ancient afterlife mythology in human history. The guardians didn't test your strength. They didn't measure your bravery. They didn't assess whether you had been a good person or a faithful believer. They tested your knowledge. Specifically, whether you knew their name, the correct phrases of passage, and the precise ritual posture required at each gate. knowledge that existed only inside one document, the document buried with you. But the architecture of the Duat went even deeper than a corridor of gates. The underworld was divided into 12 regions, mirroring the 12 hours of night, because the Egyptians had identified something extraordinary in their observations of the cosmos. Every night, without exception, the sun god Ra made the same journey through the Duat that your soul would one day make. The sun didn't disappear at dusk, it descended, traveling through the underworld, passing through all 12 regions, fighting its own battles in the dark before emerging reborn on the other side at dawn, which meant the underworld wasn't a static waiting room for the dead. It was a living, active, constantly cycling realm that the universe itself passed through every single night while you slept. You had been living adjacent to it your entire life without knowing, and when you died, you didn't enter somewhere new. You entered somewhere that had always been right beside you. The Book of the Dead mapped every corridor, every gate, every region, and armed you with everything you needed to navigate all of it. But no amount of mapping, no number of spells, no level of preparation could make what waited at the center of the Duat anything other than the most terrifying thing a soul could face. They were not symbolic. That is the single most important thing to understand about the guardians of the Duat. And it is the thing that every casual retelling of this story gets completely wrong. The modern world has trained us to approach ancient mythology as layered metaphor, to assume that a monster at a gate represents something internal, something psychological, a projection of guilt or fear or unresolved human complexity dressed up in the language of mythology. The Egyptians were not doing that. To them, the guardians were as objectively real as the Nile Delta, as physically present as the sun rising over the horizon every morning. They had names, specific, recorded, non-interchangeable names. They had defined appearances, specific weapons, and an absolute, non-negotiable authority over every soul that approached their gate. The Book of the Dead names 42 of them. 42 individual entities, each positioned at a different point along the soul's journey, each requiring a completely different response from the soul attempting to advance. Some demanded you recite their full name back to them. Not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. Others required a formal declaration of innocence against a specific category of sin before they would even acknowledge your presence. Some stood in complete silence and simply waited, because the correct response to silence was itself a form of knowledge that only the prepared soul would possess. And then there were the ones who asked questions that had no logical answer, riddles embedded in divine authority, designed specifically to expose souls who had memorized the book without genuinely understanding it, because the guardians could tell the difference, and the difference mattered absolutely. A wrong answer did not result in being sent back. There was no back. A wrong answer meant immediate consumption, a violent, irreversible unraveling of the soul that the Egyptians considered categorically worse than any physical death the living world could produce. Physical death led somewhere. What the guardians did led to nothing. 42 gates, 42 guardians, 42 opportunities for total, permanent obliteration. And every single one of them had to be passed before a soul could reach what lay beyond. But nothing. Not one of the 42 guardians, not the darkness of the corridor, not the 12 regions of the Duat, nothing compared to what was waiting at the center, because at the center you didn't face a guardian, you faced yourself. At the absolute center of the Duat stood a hall so consequential that the Egyptians gave it its own name, its own mythology, and its own permanent place in the architecture of their entire belief system. They called it the Hall of Two Truths, and what happened inside it was, without exaggeration, the most psychologically sophisticated judgment concept any ancient civilization ever produced. A system so precise, so structurally fair, and so psychologically penetrating that it made absolutely no distinction between pharaoh and slave, no distinction between the celebrated and the forgotten, between the person who had spent their life in the public eye and the one who had lived and died in complete obscurity, between the general who had commanded armies and the farmer who had never left his village. None of it registered, none of it counted. The scale didn't know your name, the scale didn't care, and that single fact made it the most terrifying thing any soul would ever face. When your soul entered the Hall of Two Truths, you were brought before a court of 42 divine judges, each one presiding over a specific moral category. Before this court, You were required to deliver what the Book of the Dead calls the negative confession, a formal, structured declaration of every sin you claimed not to have committed during your time alive. Not sins you regretted, not sins you were asking forgiveness for, sins you were asserting before a divine court with the power to end your existence, that you had never committed at all. I did not lie. I did not steal. I did not murder. I did not deceive. I did not manipulate. I did not take more than my share. I did not cause unnecessary suffering. 42 declarations, one for each judge, spoken aloud, in sequence, without hesitation. But here is where the system reveals something that is not ancient at all, something that feels uncomfortably, precisely modern, something the priests encoded into this text that no one expected them to understand. After the confession, your heart was removed from your chest, not metaphorically. In the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife, this was a literal, physical event. Your heart, the organ they believed contained the complete record of every thought, decision, desire, and secret you had carried through your entire life, was lifted out and placed on one side of a golden scale. Everything you had ever been, everything you had ever done, reduced to a single object, on a single surface, in a single moment. On the other side sat a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. A feather so light it barely registered as weight at all. Your heart had to balance it exactly. Every lie told in the dark, every cruelty committed and justified, every moment of cowardice dressed up as wisdom, every selfish decision wrapped in the language of necessity. It all accumulated in the heart as measurable, detectable, undeniable weight. Weight that no speech could remove. Weight that no status could offset. Weight that no amount of gold spent on the finest papyrus scroll in all of Egypt could correct in this moment. The wealthy Egyptian who had purchased the most elaborate copy of the Book of the Dead available was standing on that scale with the same naked vulnerability as the poorest soul who had arrived with nothing. Here, in this hall, every advantage the living world offered had already expired. The words were finished. The declarations were made. The scale would now say what the words could not, and crouched in the shadows beside it, already watching, already perfectly still, already waiting with the patience of something that had never once been denied, was the one thing in the entire Duat that had no interest in your name, your story, or your intentions, only in what the scale decided. Its name was Ammit, and the Egyptians did not design Ammit carelessly. Every element of its appearance was a deliberate, calculated choice made by a civilization that understood the psychology of fear with extraordinary precision. The head of a crocodile, the Nile's most unpredictable killer, the front body of a lion, the apex predator of the open land, the back half of a hippopotamus, the animal responsible for more human deaths in ancient Egypt than any other creature alive. 3 creatures, each one representing a different category of destruction. Each one chosen specifically because every Egyptian alive knew exactly what it meant to face one, combined into a single being whose sole, permanent, unwavering function was to consume the hearts that failed the scale, not punish, not judge, not redirect, not send away to somewhere else. Consume, completely, irrevocably, without ceremony. Because what Ammit did was not a sentence. It was a termination. The soul whose heart outweighed the feather was not sent to a place of suffering. It was not condemned to an eternal existence of pain or darkness or regret. It was simply and permanently and completely ended. The Egyptians called it the second death, the dissolution of the soul itself. No afterlife, no rebirth, no continuation of consciousness in any form. You did not go somewhere dark. You simply stopped existing. This is the fate the Book of the Dead was architected, from its very first line to its very last, to prevent, and scattered throughout its pages are spells of such specific, targeted sophistication that they reveal just how deeply the Egyptian priests understood the mechanics of the human soul, not the soul as a vague spiritual concept, the soul as a functioning system, with known vulnerabilities, known failure points, and known solutions that could be written down and carried into death like a toolkit. Spell 30 is perhaps the most haunting document produced by any ancient civilization. It is addressed not to a god, not to a guardian, not to any external force waiting in the Duat, but directly to the heart itself, the deceased's own heart, a plea, a command, a desperate, preemptive negotiation with the one witness that could not be silenced, bribed, or persuaded by anyone other than the soul it belonged to. O my heart, which I had from my mother, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the scale. Read that again and understand what it means. The ancient Egyptians understood 3,500 years before modern psychology developed the language to describe it, that the human self is not a unified thing, that the version of yourself you present to the world and the version that exists in the silent, unobserved interior of your own conscience are not always the same person, that your own heart, your own accumulated memory of every choice you ever made, could walk into the hall of two truths and say something completely different from what your mouth had just declared. So they wrote a spell to negotiate with it in advance. Beyond spell 30, the book contained protective spells for memory, because forgetting your declarations mid-confession meant immediate destruction. Spells for transformation, allowing the soul to shift forms entirely if ambushed or cornered in the outer regions of the Duat. Spells for breath, for movement, for navigating terrain that had no equivalent in the living world and no map except the one buried with you. The book didn't just prepare you for judgment, it prepared you for everything, every contingency, every possible failure point, every gap between what you intended and what the Duat would actually demand. The Egyptians had thought of everything, every gate, every guardian, every spell for every silence and every question, and every moment where the wrong response meant permanent obliteration. They had built the most comprehensive survival guide for death that any civilization had ever produced. And yet, there was one category of soul that all of it, every spell and every map and every carefully commissioned scroll, could not fully protect. The ones who never made it to the scale at all. Subscribe, hit the like button, and share this, because we promise you they don't know this part. Not everyone made it. That is the part of this story that every polished mainstream retelling quietly sidesteps, because it is profoundly uncomfortable. It is far easier to focus on the spells, the ceremonies, the elaborate preparation rituals, and allow the audience to leave with the comforting impression that the system worked for everyone who engaged with it sincerely. That preparation and faith were always sufficient, that the book always delivered what it promised. But the Book of the Dead itself tells a different story, a more honest one, and it is buried inside the text in a way that suggests even the priests who wrote it understood the contradiction they were documenting and chose to include it anyway. Within its pages, between the spells, the declarations, the mapped corridors of the Duat, are accounts of souls who got lost, not destroyed, not judged and found wanting, not consumed by Ammit, simply lost. Souls who forgot a guardian's name at the wrong gate. Souls who arrived at the Hall of Two Truths and found their memory had failed them at the precise moment it mattered most. Souls who had carried a copy of the Book of the Dead into death, held it in their wrapped hands, been buried with it pressed against their chest, but had never truly understood what they were carrying. The knowledge was there, right there, and it still wasn't enough. The Egyptians called them the Mut, the wandering dead, souls trapped in the outer regions of the Duat, in a state that had no equivalent anywhere in the living world, not suffering exactly, not at peace exactly, but existing in a permanent, directionless, conscious disorientation that the priests described as the most pitiable fate a soul could face outside of Ammit's consumption, not ending, not resting, not moving forward, just wandering, endlessly, in a darkness that never changed and never ended and never offered a single landmark to navigate by. The priests who wrote the Book of the Dead framed the Mut as souls who had failed morally or spiritually, who had lived badly, prepared poorly, and arrived in the Duat, carrying the full weight of their own negligence. It was a clean narrative, a logical one. It fit perfectly inside the belief system they had constructed. But here is where the story turns, in a direction that nobody sees coming, because the archaeology doesn't agree with the priests, not even slightly. When Egyptologists began cataloging the thousands of recovered papyrus copies of the Book of the Dead, examining them not as sacred religious texts, but as physical objects with production histories, economic contexts, and manufacturing patterns, they found something that the official mythology had never once acknowledged, something hiding in plain sight inside documents that had been sitting in museum collections for over a century, blank spaces, inside professionally produced, commercially sold, family-purchased copies of the most important document a soul could carry into death. Blank spaces where the deceased's name should have been inserted by the scribe. Copies that had been mass-produced for efficiency, packaged for grieving families who trusted the system, and buried with the dead without a single person stopping to verify that the personalization had actually been completed, which meant that somewhere in the Duat, according to the very belief system the priests had spent centuries constructing, were souls navigating a book that didn't know who they were, reciting declarations that named someone else, presenting credentials at divine gates that belonged to a complete stranger. The last copy of the Book of the Dead, written for actual burial use, was produced somewhere around 50 BCE. By then, Egypt had been absorbed into the Greek world, then the Roman world, and the belief system that had sustained one of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations for over 3,000 years was quietly, irreversibly dissolving. New gods arrived with new empires. New answers were offered to the same questions that had always driven human beings to the absolute edge of what language could express. It answered them with gates and guardians and scales and spells, and a 42-point moral inventory delivered before a divine court that had no interest in excuses and no capacity for sympathy. It said, here is what exists beyond death. Here is its structure. Here is its internal logic. Here is what you will face when you get there. And here, in your hands, right now, is everything you need to face it. That level of certainty is what makes this document so remarkable and so strange, and so completely impossible to dismiss. All of it is the same conversation, the same unresolved tension at the center of human consciousness that the Egyptian priests sat down to address in writing and refused to leave vague. We just stopped writing the answers down so specifically. And maybe that is the most revealing thing of all, not about the ancient Egyptians, but about us. The Egyptian priests had the audacity or the wisdom, depending entirely on how you look at it, to commit completely, to put it in writing, to say this is exactly what we believe death looks like from the inside and build an entire civilization around that declaration without hedging once. What happens when we die? Is there something after? And if there is, does the way we lived determine what we find there? The Book of the Dead did not invent those questions, but it did something that no document in human history had done before it, and that no document produced in the 3,500 years since has fully replicated. It answered them with architecture, not faith, not philosophy, not the careful hedged language of a tradition designed to comfort without committing to anything specific enough to be proven wrong. Since the moment Wallace Budge pulled that first scroll from an Egyptian tomb in 1888 and realized he was holding something that had no logical business still existing, we have never stopped asking the same questions the priests were asking in 1550 BCE. Every religion that has ever organized human civilization around the concept of a post-death judgment, every philosophy that has argued morality needs no divine enforcement to be real. All of it is the same conversation, the same unresolved tension at the center of human consciousness that the Egyptian priests sat down to address in writing and refused to leave vague. We just stopped writing the answers down so specifically, and maybe that is the most revealing thing of all, not about the ancient Egyptians, but about us. The Egyptian priests had the audacity or the wisdom, depending entirely on how you look at it, to commit completely, to put it in writing, to say this is exactly what we believe death looks like from the inside and build an entire civilization around that declaration without hedging once. Every 3 a.m. thought spiral that has kept a human being staring at a dark ceiling, running the private arithmetic of their own choices, and wondering quietly, honestly, with no audience what that math eventually adds up to. That the version of yourself you present to the world and the version that exists in the unobserved interior of your own conscience are not the same person, and that the difference between those two versions is not invisible to everything, that somewhere, in some framework, operating beyond the reach of status, wealth, or the stories we construct about ourselves, your heart already knows exactly what it weighs. The Book of the Dead is not scripture. It is not mythology in the comfortable, safely distant sense of that word. It is not a relic of a civilization too ancient to touch anything happening right now. It is a mirror 3,500 years old, still perfectly clear, still reflecting the same face back at anyone willing to stand in front of it without looking away. Still asking the only question it has ever asked, of every soul that has ever been brave enough to look directly into it. How heavy is your heart? If this story moved you, subscribe, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it. The next story we're telling is one that history buried even deeper, and trust us, you are not ready for it.